Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining the Arts and Humanities Council of Montgomery County's free webinar for our Programming and Capacity Building Project Grants opportunity. I'm Takinia, the Grants Director for the Council, and I'm here with my phenomenal staff. We all work on seeing these grants from cradle to grave. So this is how the webinar is going to play out. I'm going to go through the whole presentation without stopping, but there will be time at the end for me to answer any questions you may have. So know that while I won't stop in the middle to answer questions, you can put your questions into the chat at any point. So if I'm talking and you automatically think of a question, just drop it in the chat and I'll address it at the end of the presentation. Also keep in mind that this presentation covers a variety of topics, including how to navigate SurveyMonkey Apply, which is the portal that you use to submit all of your documents, your applications, your work samples, your supplementary materials, and also you'll be in there if you get an award for the post-award phase where you sign a grant agreement form and work on reporting. I am not going to cover that section of the webinar. My colleague Ana Alicia, who is quite the tech wizard, will go through the SM Apply section of this webinar. And again, I'll be happy to answer any questions you may have when both of us are done speaking. All right, so we begin all of our public meetings with a land acknowledgement. The Arts and Humanities Council of Montgomery County acknowledges that we are in Montgomery County, Maryland, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Accohonic, the Assateague, the Piscataway, the Pocomoke, Shawnee, and Naze-Wawash people, among other Indigenous communities. We ask you to join us in acknowledging these communities, their elders, both past and present, as well as future generations. So here's what we're going to cover today. I'm going to briefly discuss why the Arts and Humanities Council exists and our role in the community. I'll go over the grants process, the different stages that applications go through, the different reviewers that are involved. I'm going to cover the guidelines. Please, please, please remember to read the guidelines more than once. There's a lot of information in the guidelines. So even though I'm covering the guidelines today, we do need all of our applicants to go back to the guidelines repeatedly as you are working on your proposals to make sure that your project is in alignment with the guidelines. Again, read them more than once, because normally what happens is that most applicants will miss different sections of the guidelines as they're working on their projects. And it's really important to understand the guidelines in their entirety. If at any point you are confused about the guidelines, please do not hesitate to reach out to staff for clarity. So I'll also cover the required application materials. As I mentioned earlier, my colleague Ana Alicia will cover SM Apply, the portal we use for all of the documents you're submitting. I'll go over some general grant writing tips and I'll answer any questions you may have. So this is the mission and the vision for the Arts and Humanities Council. I'm not going to read it verbatim. You can simply read the slide, but know that we exist to serve a vibrant creative community that is housed specifically in Montgomery County. So our grant awards are designated for Montgomery County specifically. The Montgomery County local government gives us money that we use for re-granting per their legal requirements. We can only use grant funds for activities in Montgomery County. This is important to keep in mind, and I will bring it up more than once during this presentation. But know that we are delighted to serve such a large, diverse community. You probably already know this, but I'm going to say it anyway. Montgomery County is large. It's the size of a small state. It's the size of Rhode Island, so that means that we have a large swath of territory to support. Equity and inclusion forms the crux of all of our funding opportunities. It is highly important. This equity and inclusion statement is within all of our guidelines for every grant opportunity that we offer to the community. Again, I'm not going to read this verbatim because you can read it on your own. It's in our guidelines, but do keep in mind that we want all of our applicants to ask themselves honestly, is there anyone in our audience that we should be serving but are not? Are there any communities that have the mistaken impression that they are somehow not invited to the table? Are there any historically underrepresented communities that we could do a better job of making sure that they are aware of our offerings? This is something that you should ask yourselves, and this is something that the council, we ask ourselves internally all the time. So know that this is a true two-way street. While we ask you to engage in this work, know that the council is also involved in this work as well. We also have taken an honest look at our composition internally, and you should do the same. So in addition to your outputs, your outreach efforts, your external audience, take a look internally and ask yourselves if there is an equitable composition of people who are in decision-making positions within your organization or group. So that means if you're in an organization with 501c3 status, do you have a diverse board? If you're a group that doesn't have 501c3 status, or again, if you're an organization that does, take a look at your leadership, ask yourself, do we have a diversity of people who make decisions about our strategic planning? And by this, I mean, diversity is important as a whole, but, we could go on this subject for a very long time. Sadly, the arts and humanities community nationwide has struggled with diversity at senior levels. So while there may be a number of organizations that have diversity for entry-level positions, when you get to the senior level positions, that's where the diversity tends to stop. We know that this takes time to rectify, but we do want you and need you to engage in this journey and come up with a plan if your top structure lacks diversity. So do keep that in mind, and we need diversity in every sense of the word: ethnicity, race, gender spectrum, sexuality spectrum, economics, differently abled individuals, and the list goes on. It's all broken down here. And also we want you to consider accessibility. So ADA compliance is embedded in equity and inclusion. We only have the statements separated for your ease to read, for readability, because if these were combined, it would be a humongous paragraph, but know that they're equally important. They're interwoven. We need to ensure that any public programming we support is accessible. So legally, we cannot support projects that are not open to individuals who are differently abled. So do keep that in mind. And also too, you need to make sure that internally, your organization is equipped to hire individuals who could work for you if the individual has a disability. So if you own a space or you're working in an office space, please take a look and make sure that your space is ADA compliant. Also keep in mind that if you are one of those organizations or groups that realizes they need to step up their game in this area, know that we are always happy to pay for ADA compliance and accessibility. So know that with any of our funding opportunities, the cost of making your space or your project more accessible is always an allowable cost, and you can always include that in your budget. We're happy to pay for it. So we have DEIA resources on our website. At the end of this presentation, later on, you'll get a copy of the slide deck, so you don't have to write down these hyperlinks. You'll see it in the slides, you'll see it on our website. We encourage you to explore these resources. And again, if you need help with this subject, which is highly nuanced, we do understand that, please feel free to contact staff. We're always happy to discuss DEIA. So here's the application deadline. Please memorize this, do what you need to do to remember it, set as many alarms as you need to, because we cannot accept late applications. This deadline is set in stone. It's always heartbreaking the day after deadline when we get emails or phone calls from applicants pleading for extra time because they missed the deadline. Unfortunately, we can't offer any extensions. So please, please, please memorize this date. So here's the journey that your application will go through. So you saw the application deadline. This is the time to get your questions answered, because when the deadline passes, your proposal needs to stand on its own. So when the deadline passes, staff will do an eligibility check. Now, we're not checking for competitiveness. We're checking to make sure that the applicant aligns with our eligibility requirements and that the project is in alignment with our eligibility requirements. And I'll discuss those requirements in more detail later on. If we deem that the applicant is not eligible or that the project itself is not eligible, you will hear from us. We will contact you and explain why the project is not eligible. If you don't hear from us during this phase, that's a good thing. That means that your project is eligible. And if your project is eligible, the next thing you'll hear from us is an announcement of the panel meeting date. We highly encourage applicants to attend our panel review. They are done virtually over Zoom because of the pandemic. We want to keep everyone safe. But keep in mind that these are open panel reviews, and there are plenty of grant makers that don't offer this learning opportunity. A lot of grant makers do private meetings, but we want the field to learn and grow. And this is a wonderful way to learn about how you can improve upon future project submittals, and also to hear discussions about what's going on in the field. What happens is that we discuss every proposal, but also the panel will bring up trends in the sector or challenges that the whole sector is facing. And you'll want to hear that conversation. It can be very thought-provoking. If you have the time, try to stay for the full meeting. I know you all are busy, so if you can't do it, we understand. We know that some applicants have to jump in and they hear their proposal review and then they leave. And if you have to do that, we understand. But if you're able to carve out time and stick around and hear the discussion of other proposals under review, it is highly educational. So the panel is comprised of a diverse collective of professionals. I work really hard to ensure that our panel embodies diversity because, again, this is in alignment with our equity and inclusion statement. I discussed, previously, that statement is embedded in everything that we do, including panel recruitment. So panels are comprised of diversity in terms of how the professionals self-identify in terms of identity. So again, race, ethnicity, gender, age, sexuality spectrum, etc. It's also diverse in terms of their professional expertise. So know that all panelists will have a strong understanding of the arts and humanities sector. And we also make sure that panelists have a strong understanding of all the other practical components that are needed to bring a project into fruition. So that's financial management, fundraising, marketing, communication, organizational capacity, the full bit. So they come with this wide breadth of knowledge, and they will assess the strengths of your proposals and will bring up any elements that could have been improved upon. And after the panel meeting is done, we present the panel's feedback to the grants committee. And similar to our panel, again, embodying equity and inclusion, it's the crux of all that we do. The grants committee is also comprised of a diverse collective of professionals who have a very strong understanding of our arts and humanities sector. And sometimes, a grants committee member will join a panel meeting too, just to listen as well. And then they, review all of the panel's comments in their entirety. And then the grants committee will present their understanding of which proposals should be funded and if there are any declines. They present their understanding of the panel's assessment to the board. The board has the final say on who gets an award and if there are any declines. When the board makes their final determination, which will be in mid to late June, then we make an announcement to the public about who receives an award and if there are any declines. Now, know that when we make that public announcement, that is your time to request a feedback appointment from staff. We're happy to give feedback appointments. Even if you get an award, it's really smart to request a feedback appointment to ensure that you understand the panel's assessment of the work that you're engaged in. I also bring this up because do keep in mind that at the panel meeting, this is not your time to defend your proposal. Again, after the deadline, it needs to stand on its own. So you are not allowed to speak to the panel. You attend and, you have to remain quiet. You take whatever notes you need to take, but it's not your time to defend the proposal. It's also not your time to defend the proposal to staff. Sometimes what happens during panel meetings is that, applicants try to email us during the meeting. We won't be able to help you out. We're doing a lot of multitasking during the meeting. So your questions will have to wait until we make the public announcement, and then we can handle any questions you may have during the feedback appointment. So I'm going to cover the guidelines, which again are highly important. There's a lot of info written on these slides, and I may not read all of these slides verbatim, but I want you to read the slides and then go back to the guidelines, reread them to make sure you understand what's written in this document. So this funding opportunity is a multidisciplinary opportunity, and it really is designed for organizations and groups with smaller budgets, but we want to ensure that organizations and groups with smaller budgets are given the support they need to sustain their innovative work. So that means that we want to promote healthy growth. If you decide to grow, again, you don't have to grow. The arts and humanities is coming from a perspective of one size doesn't fit all. Small, mid-size, and large organizations all have a role to play in terms of diversity in our communities. So, we don't think that large or mid-size organizations are any more important than smaller organizations. Do keep that in mind. And I want you to also keep that in mind, just because I think there's this sad myth in the nonprofit sector that bigger is better. We're not the for-profit sector, and bigger is not always better. And do be careful of reckless growth. That is why this category exists. Sometimes it's healthier to remain with your smaller budget. There's nothing sadder for us to see than an organization that grows too quickly and then ends up with severe debt and then is basically destabilized because of their debt, which is why you want to be careful about reckless growth. But if you are engaged in growth, we are happy to support healthy, sustainable growth. Obviously, we're here to support innovative arts and humanities programming, help out with your management infrastructure, as I was explaining earlier, and help ensure that our community maintains its vibrant diversity in terms of its arts and humanities offerings. So our grant awards are capped at 10,000. You can't request more than that. You also can't request under 1,000. Do keep in mind that in order to receive over 5,000, you do have to have 501c3 status. So if you are a group that's applying without 501c3 status, you cannot request over $5,000. So all of our applicants have to have an arts or humanities-focused mission, your primary location or verifiable mailing address has to be in Montgomery County for at least 12 consecutive months prior to the application deadline. This is highly important, folks. We normally get a few applicants who think they can potentially negotiate to bend the rules. So if you happen to have a address in PG County, but then you claim to also do some limited programming in Montgomery County, that's not the same as having a primary location and or verifiable mailing address in Montgomery County. I'll state it again. I don't want to sound like a broken record, but per legal requirements, our local money, which is local taxpayer money, has to stay in the county. We don't have a choice in that. It's a legal requirement. All right. And if you just got your address in Montgomery County this year, you're not eligible yet. We need to ensure that you have a track record. So that means that you need to have had your primary location or verifiable mailing address in the county for at least 12 consecutive months prior to the application deadline. This is highly important. Do contact staff if you're confused about this rule. All right, so for this category, as I mentioned earlier, applicants can have nonprofit status, or you can be a group without 501c3 status. Just keep in mind that if you do not have 501c3 status, we basically approach our groups with the understanding that they are operating in a manner that's very similar to a nonprofit, even if they don't have nonprofit status. And if you have received grants from us previously, just make sure that you've met all those outstanding requirements by the application deadline. So there's some flexibility in terms of what we can fund with this project grant, which is, wonderful in that we changed this category through, research with our grants committee and the board. We believe that, it's important that small organizations have access to funds that, in addition to programming, that can also, provide for overall stability, organizational capacity, strategic planning. So know that we can support programming. We're happy to do that. We can support the creation of new work. We can support a public event or program, and we're also happy to support capacity building. And the nice thing about that is, given all of the changes that have occurred because of the pandemic, I know that a number of groups and organizations are taking an honest look at the way that they're structured, and you may need to restructure. It could be that your old model is not really working anymore because the pandemic has shifted so much in terms of our economic reality. So know that if you need a grant just for strategic planning, which is highly important, we're happy to do that. You need funds for professional development, we're happy to do that as well. All right, so you do have some restrictions in terms of the time frame for when your project can start and end. So your project can begin no earlier than July 1st, 2022, and it should be done by June 30th, 2023. So you have a solid year to finish up your project. Again, your project has to take place in Montgomery County. So if you're housed in Montgomery County, but you want your project to take place in Virginia, that's not eligible. Again, the funds need to stay in the county. Your events, if you decide to apply for programming, must be open to the public, so they can't be exclusive. And it's up to you whether you want to charge an admission fee or keep the event free. Either option is eligible. Do keep in mind that if you are engaging in public programming that's in person, please abide by the guidelines for in-person events that are mandated by the Montgomery County Health Department. All right, we want everyone to be safe. So ensure that you're keeping an eye on the Montgomery County Health Department's website, because these guidelines, as we all know, can change rapidly. So you want to make sure that if you're engaging in in-person activities, that you're abiding by these rules and regulations. Also keep in mind that we are more than happy to support virtual events. That is totally allowable. And if you're doing some hybrid event, maybe part of the event is virtual, part of it's in person, or you're doing an in-person event, but you also want people to be able to access it virtually, we're also happy to do that. All right. So I'm not going to read this list verbatim because, you know, you can. But basically, this list gives you an example of the wide diversity of activities that we can support. So performances, exhibitions, presentations, historical presentations, you know, public art, professional development for staff or board, strategic planning, technology upgrades. I saw a question pop up in the chat about what counts as capacity building. It's basically what's listed on this slide here. Technology upgrades, strategic planning, professional development. If you're thinking of some other form of capacity building that I haven't mentioned, then I would highly suggest that you reach out to staff prior to submitting your application and discuss how you define capacity building if it's different from what I've already mentioned. Do keep in mind that this list is not exhaustive. So that's why if you have an idea for a project, but you don't think it's quite in alignment with what's listed here, do contact staff to ensure that your project is eligible. So we do have some grant limitations in terms of what we cannot fund. Keep in mind that this is not a general operating expense grant. Okay, so try your best to avoid submitting an application with 10 different activities. That will make you less competitive. You don't want to confuse the panel. You want a clear, concise project. All right, so try your best to avoid submitting an application where you're asking for funding to present Othello to the community, and you also want professional development for your board because you want to heighten your fundraising. Oh, and you also need some new computers, and you also want to work on your emergency preparedness plan for strategic planning. That's technically like 5 different projects, all right? So the strongest proposals are centered on one of the items that I just listed, and you provide a detailed, compelling discussion for why that one item on that long list I mentioned will enhance your organization's capabilities to serve your local community. Keep in mind that we cannot pay for indirect costs that are not directly related to carrying out the funded project. This becomes really important when you design your budget. So, you know, I'll talk about the budget a little bit later, but do keep that in mind when you're working on your project budget. Please don't list miscellaneous or contingency costs on your budget. We can't pay for that because, again, these are public taxpayer funds. And because it's public money, we need to know exactly how it will be used. So that means that miscellaneous or contingency is unallowable. And that's true for most public funding in general. So it's a good rule of thumb to keep in mind when you're applying to other public grant makers as well. We can't support public or private charter schools. We can't support brick and mortar. So while we can support planning, if you decide that you need to build a new space, we can support a plan for that if it's embedded in your strategic plan, but we can't support the actual cost of building that space. You also can't purchase property with our grants. You can purchase technology, but you can't purchase a whole new theater, all right? So we also cannot fund activities for the exclusive benefit of organizations or a group's members. Remember, these are supposed to be inclusive projects, no exclusivity going on here. That's not what public funds are about. Unfortunately, we can't support we can't pay for your fundraising activities. We also can't pay for the cost of receptions, food, alcohol. If you are selling merchandise, we can't pay for that. We can't pay for your debt. You definitely cannot use our grants for re-granting, and we definitely cannot support political advocacy or any activities that support or promote the interests of any one political party or candidate. And this should go without saying, I've said it multiple times, our funds need to stay in the county, so we definitely cannot pay for any travel outside of the United States. So this is also important to keep in mind because I think there's been some confusion here in terms of what projects or grants applicants think they can apply for. So if you are applying for general operating support, whether it's general operating support 1 or general operating support 2, you can't apply here, okay? You pick either or, right? So normally the applicants that are not eligible for general operating support, normally that just has to do with size of budget, honestly, and staffing capacity. You apply here and programming and capacity if you have a smaller budget. Also keep in mind that you can't apply for programming and capacity building and an advancement grant. You also can't apply for this category and a capital grant. Capital grants are not a funding opportunity that we oversee. So if you have questions about that, you need to contact the county directly. Capital grants are a brick and mortar grant opportunity that is funded by the Montgomery County government. And so if you're interested in that, contact them because we don't oversee that category. We can't fund for-profit businesses, all right? All of our funding opportunities support nonprofit organizations and groups that operate as a nonprofit, even if they don't have 501c3 status. So if you're a group and you're straight for-profit, then you're not eligible. We also can't support grant requests for the same project in more than one grant category. So to give you an example, we have applicants very often who will apply for a programming and capacity building project grant. And then in the fall, they'll apply for a Wheaton grant. And that's great. That's totally allowable. Just make sure that if you're applying for this category and the Wheaton cultural grants, that it's not the same project, that you're not using 2 grants for the exact same project. I'm not going to discuss Wheaton here, but know that, that's a specific category that's designated to support Wheaton specifically. If you're interested in that, please sign up for our newsletters and we'll have announcements about that funding opportunity way later on this year after we get through this panel season. So the evaluative criteria is highly important. This is what the panel uses to evaluate all of your proposals. It's their roadmap. I think it's pretty self-explanatory, but do read how we've defined all 4 of these evaluative criteria. Read it more than once. If you have any questions about how we've defined our criteria, please let us know. So programming quality, I think it's pretty strict. That's tied to how you discuss the vibrancy and creativity of your arts or humanities offerings, but it's also closely tied to your work sample as well. So your work sample, which is a clear example of your programmatic offerings to the community, are linked to this evaluative criteria here. The quality of the project and community impact are interrelated. Community impact, I need to speak about for a bit because it's the highest numerical point allotment. Again, this shouldn't surprise you because I brought up equity and inclusion repeatedly, because again, it's the crux of what we do. It's the core goal of all of our funding opportunities. So keep in mind that if you are one of those organizations that has a broad mission, so I'm going to give you a hypothetical. Let's say you are the Montgomery County Modern Art Museum, and your mission is to present the highest quality modern art to the public. There's nothing wrong with that mission, but know that if you have a broad mission like that, and you don't have a clear discussion of diversity, because that broad mission means that you're supposedly presenting everyone, right? So if the panel determines that your list of artists are homogenous, or that your staff is homogenous, your board is homogenous, what you need to do is, if I'm describing you, if I'm describing you as an applicant and you know your organization or group struggles with diversity, but you have a broad mission, please tackle it head on. Do not dance around the issue. The best way to approach this is to be honest and to tell the panel, we realize that we have struggled historically with equity and inclusion. Here is our plan to rectify this over the next few years. So again, we know this doesn't happen overnight. Change doesn't happen overnight, but you should have a plan that you're working on. We realize that sometimes people stumble in this work. Maybe you had one plan, that plan didn't work as well. So you had plan A, you tried that out. Now you're going to plan B. You can describe that as well. Just make sure you communicate to the panel that you're cognizant of the importance of equity and inclusion, that you recognize if this is something you struggled with, you're very aware of it, and that you have a plan to tackle it over time. The worst thing you can do is to submit a proposal where your organization has a broad mission, like the one I just described, and your answer in this section is, oh, we serve everyone, and you leave it at that. You need to have proof of quote unquote serving everyone. You'll notice that in the application, we ask for detailed discussion of your audience, as in details of how does your audience self-identify to your understanding. So, you know, I just want you to understand that if you submit a "we serve everyone" statement and there's nothing else to back that up, you're going to hear from the panel, you're going to hear from their confusion. They're going to ask, you know, for evidence. So keep all that in mind. The quality of the project, admin capabilities, there's some overlap there. Admin capabilities, really just the logical step-by-step process of planning. You know, you'll see questions in the application about, like, give us a timeline. When are you doing what? So let's say you're doing a programming project, you know, discuss when you're planning on, let's say it's a play, you're presenting Othello. So when are you planning on doing the casting call? How will you approach marketing? When will the marketing occur? You know, what is the time frame for how long the play will be presented to the public? Then what are you doing in terms of evaluation to figure out if the project was successful? All of that should be clearly described in your proposal. And importantly, admin capability also applies to the budget. So you want to make sure that your budget clearly matches the narrative questions, clearly matches the discussion of what will occur in the project. You know, I'm going to come back again to conciseness, and do not assume that bigger is better. I think sometimes what happens in this category is that we have applicants who mistakenly think that if they present a mega project where they claim to serve, you know, thousands of people, that will be more competitive. Not necessarily. Don't assume that. So if you're an organization, you only have 2 full-time staff, you have, you know, a great relationship with your volunteers, that's great. And there's nothing wrong with that. But think about what you can do in terms of your own capacity. Okay, so let's go back to the theater company example. So a theater company with 2 full-time staff and, you know, some great volunteers who are devoted to the cause. Let's say you have 5 volunteers that are devoted to the cause. What can be competitive in that scenario is presenting Othello for a 2-week run, right? And that's it, and that's great. Don't assume that's not competitive. Here's where you could go wrong. So you have an organization with 2 full-time staff and 5 great volunteers. And instead of doing Othello, you decide that you want to do a month-long theater festival presenting 20 different plays of various different sizes. So you're going to do some plays with only, you know, 1 person, and then have some plays that have a cast of 20 people. And then, you know, that's unwieldy, right? So having a theater festival presenting 20 plays and you have a teeny staff, that's not more competitive than the other alternative I mentioned. And here's why. If the panel thinks you don't have the structure to carry out a project of that size, even if you claim that you're going to reach thousands of diverse community members, they're going to be concerned, okay? Because we don't want to see any kind of burnout. That's not what we support. We don't support, which I think is a serious issue in this sector, artists who are severely overworked and underpaid. They will point that out, so keep that in mind as well. So if you have a small budget, let's say this organization with 2 people and 5 volunteers has a budget of 7,000. That's not in alignment with a festival that lasts for a month. So the panel will wonder, how are you going to equitably pay all these artists? How are you going to ensure that the two full-time staff members won't just collapse from burnout? How are you going to ensure that you can pay for everything from whether it's an outdoor venue or an indoor space? You know, doing a festival is expensive, all the tech requirements, the cleanup afterwards, all of those various different details. And then on top of that too, as you all know, we're operating in a pandemic, and we know that that has added costs. So if you're doing something in person and you have to think about testing people and air filtration, and all of that adds up. And if you're doing something of this nature, in-person festival, you haven't thought of all those details financially, they're not in the budget, the panel will be concerned and you risk getting a lower score. So I know I've said a lot. And if you have any questions about this, I don't want to harp on it for too long, but it is important that you want to make sure the project is in alignment with your capabilities. And don't assume that a mega project will be more competitive. You know, the projects that can be most competitive are concise, clear planning, and are in direct alignment with the capabilities of the group or the organization from an admin perspective. So also keep this in mind. This is a new rule for all of our funding opportunities, that if you receive a score of below 60 points, you're not eligible for a grant award. Now, also keep in mind that if you receive a score over 60 points, that does not mean that you'll automatically get a grant award, but it does mean that you're eligible to get an award. I don't want this to scare people. Normally, it's only 1 or 2 applicants that score below 60. If we get any that score below 60, it's pretty uncommon for our applicants to score this low, but it is something to keep in mind, particularly since we're working in a very competitive environment right now. So, you know, it's a rule to keep in mind. All right, required application materials. I'm going to try my best not to speak too much, spend too much time on this, because it is covered in depth in the guidelines. And again, you need to read this section in the guidelines closely beyond just listening to me speak. It's important stuff. So we have a variety of required materials in addition to answering all the questions in the narrative. There's support materials, programming materials, work samples that you'll have to upload. Keep in mind that all of your materials need to be in PDF format, but you have a little bit more flexibility with your work samples in terms of format. So for groups, please upload a list of all your members. Please remember to highlight members who work and/or reside in Montgomery County. The more you have, the more competitive you will be, because it shows buy-in to the community. Bios of key group members or volunteers are important. Please take your time writing these bios. You want to make sure that you are bragging about your colleagues. It should really be clear to the panel how their capabilities shine. Their capabilities should be in alignment with the project that you've designed. So, you know, don't rush on this. Do, you know, excellently written bios, submit excellently written bios that really show off why your staff and volunteers are so phenomenal. If you have a strategic plan or organizational chart, please upload it. It's not required, but know that it's helpful for the panel if you happen to have one handy. All right, so in terms of financial support materials, we need your previous fiscal year's end of year revenue and expenses, also known as a profit and loss statement, your current fiscal year's operating budget with actuals year to date, and your current balance sheet if you have it. If this seems daunting or confuses you at all, please do not hesitate to reach out to Karen. Karen, who's the grants manager for the council, does an awesome job breaking down financial support materials to people who may be new to this process. So she's happy to help. Don't, you know, hesitate to reach out to her if you're confused about what to submit in terms of financial support materials. For organizations that have 501c3 status, we need your IRS letter of determination. list of board of directors with affiliation. Please remember to highlight members who work and or reside in Montgomery County. As I just said, the more you have, the more competitive you are, because it shows that you are firmly entrenched in supporting our local community. Again, bios of key staff and volunteers are very important. Like I just mentioned, brag about your coworkers, brag about your board. And if you happen to have a current strategic plan or organizational chart, please submit it. Also, for organizations with 501c3 status, we need your FY21 990, 990EZ or 990N, or letter of extension if you don't have it at the immediate moment. Know that if you don't have the 990s by the deadline, you have some time to get it to us. Just make sure that we receive these documents no later than June 1st, 2022. Specifically for the 990, the 990EZ or the 990N. We need a profit and loss statement for the most recently completed fiscal year, a balance sheet for the most recently completed fiscal year, and current fiscal year operating budget with actuals year to date. I'll say it again, Karen does an awesome job describing these requirements. Yes, the 990 is absolutely required if you have 501c3 status. I'm going to answer that question because I saw it pop up. If you don't have 501c3 status, it's not required. But if you have 501c3 status, it's required. And again, you do have time. You can submit it. We just need to receive it no later than June 1st. And Karen's happy to help. All right, for programming support materials, one PDF with no more than 5 pages. Read the list here. This is not an exhaustive list, so if there are other items that you think are applicable to this section of the application and you're not sure if you should submit those items, please contact us and we'll be happy to help you out. Please abide by these page limits and the hyperlink limits. Keep in mind that we want you to think strategically about support materials. Keep in mind that the panel has a lot to review. Each year, we've seen an increase in the number of proposals that are submitted for this category. So you want to make sure that you are carefully choosing the highest quality support materials that you have access to that really pop. You are not more competitive if you submit a PDF with 10 pages instead of 5 for a couple of reasons. The panel can't absorb 10 pages. They don't have the time, but also 2, we've instituted a new rule where if you surpass these page limits, we're gonna have to remove the pages. So that means that if you submit a PDF with more than 5 pages, whatever follows, the first 5 pages will be cut off and the panel will not see it. So, you know, these are, oops, I'm going to go back one slide. These are documents that show off your offerings to the community. It can be positive reviews of your work, marketing materials, examples of similar previously completed work. So you have some room to play around here. And if you have any questions about what should be uploaded here, just ask staff. So work samples are really important. As I mentioned, they are tied to the first evaluative criteria. So, you know, work samples should show off how phenomenal your offerings are to the community in terms of your programming. Think like a curator. Again, you know, you want to submit the best of the best, and you have limitations here in terms of how many samples you can submit as well. So again, you don't have the option to submit 20 work samples, and it's to your benefit, because back in the day when we didn't have these rules instituted, we actually got complaints from the panel because they couldn't absorb everything. And you don't want your stellar work to be overshadowed by a work sample that happens to be mediocre that got thrown into the mix. So you want to take your time looking at what you have that really shows you in the best light. All right. Keep in mind that if you are performing arts or media arts, we highly encourage you to submit audio or video work samples, not stills or photos. Stills or photos, that's applicable for visual arts, but not for performing in media arts. So let's say you're a dance company. Well, you might have some gorgeous photos, of your ballerina doing on point, doing a pirouette, that doesn't help the panel unless it's a marketing material, unless it's, for programming, supplementary materials. For the work sample, we would need to see a video of the ballerina dancing. All right. So I hope that makes sense. If it doesn't, just contact staff. Also keep in mind that you want to provide a clear description of your work sample. You want to explain to the panel why you have chosen a particular work sample so that they understand why it's relevant to the project and also why it's relevant for the work that you offer to the community. So here are your limitations. I'm not going to go through each one because, again, it's listed in our guidelines, but please remember to abide by these limitations because, again, if you surpass them, the panel won't see access beyond, 10 images or beyond 2 videos. They won't see anything that goes beyond these limitations. Keep in mind that if you do not have editing capabilities when it comes to audio and video, that's really okay. There's nothing wrong with that. You just need to give the panel directions. So let's say that gorgeous video of your principal ballerina dancing a solo, let's say that's 10 minutes and you don't have the time to edit it. It's okay. Just tell the panel to fast forward to a certain time and stop watching at a certain time so it abides by the time limitations that we've listed in our guidelines. Keep in mind that if you're in the literary field or the humanities field and you're submitting written work, please, please, please do not upload a PDF that has 6-point font and narrow margins. The panel can't absorb that. Please make sure it's double spaced with at least 11-point font and 1-inch margin so that the panel can read it easily. All right. You don't want to give them a hard time. They need to quickly understand why your work is so vibrant. So I'm not going to discuss this again at length because I just mentioned what's listed on this slide. I don't want to sound like a broken record. But again, think about quality, not quantity. It's true for work samples and supplementary materials. But again, this also connects to your design of the project. As I said earlier, bigger is not always better. All right. So quality, not quantity. More samples does not necessarily make you more competitive. So if we have an applicant who submits 5 mediocre work samples, they are less competitive than an applicant that submits 2 stellar work samples. So keep that in mind. All right. Any questions about this stuff, just reach out to staff. We're happy to provide our opinion on which work samples might be more competitive if you're really torn about which ones to choose. So I already mentioned this, but it's important, folks, that if you exceed these limitations, we're just going to cut it out. All right. So you give us 6 work samples. We'll take the first 5. That last remaining 1 will not be seen by the panel. Just keep that in mind. All right, so I'm going to pass the baton over to my colleague, Ana Alicia, who will cover SurveyMonkey.
Thank you, Takenia. Just want to clear up some misconceptions in the chat. Just want to reiterate that the 5-page limit is for programming support materials and that work samples have a 10-page limit. And please reach out to staff if you have any questions about this. I know it can sound a little bit confusing, but really these limits are for both your benefit and for the panel's benefit. With that, I'll go ahead and start on the SurveyMonkey Apply Guide. My name is Ana Alicia Fang. I'm the Grants Program Assistant Manager, and I'll be walking you through some basics for SurveyMonkey Apply, which is our grants portal. We also call it SM Apply for short. Here we go. So we recommend using either Google Chrome or Firefox for your web browser for best performance. You can access SM Apply via either of the 2 links on the screen. These are also available in our guidelines and on our website. On our website, if you go to the Programming and Capacity Building Project Grants page, when you scroll down, you should see a tab with a couple headers. And if you click on application and templates in big font, you should see text that says ready to apply. Click here to access the SM Apply Grants portal, and that will take you exactly where you need to go. Just for reference, this is what the homepage should look like. If you are on a site that does not look like this, then you're probably not in the right place. It should have my contact information as well as Karen Judson's contact information. She's our grants program manager. For those of you that are coming over from Fluid Review, which is our previous portal, you can go ahead and use the same email and password without having to create a new account. If you're a completely new user, then you will have to register and create a new account. So just fill in the required fields. And once you click create account, you should look for an email to confirm your email address. The reason this is so important is because users that don't verify their email will actually not have access to all of the features in the site, such as the submit button. So as soon as you create your account, go ahead and look for an email verification, click that green confirm email address button, and that should set you up with your account. You'll also receive a follow-up email confirming that your email has been verified and that you can go ahead and use the full site. Just some few basics in account settings. Account settings can be accessed by clicking on your name in the upper right-hand corner and then clicking My Account. There are 3 different account settings, those being your profile, notifications, and eligibility. In your profile, that's where you can change your name, your email, your phone number if necessary, and also just make sure that your account is set to the correct time zone. So if any deadlines look a little funny, make sure you check the time zone first. In the notification settings, we please ask that you do not uncheck the 1st and 4th notification preferences. We do need to be able to contact you through the site. Those middle 2 preferences are really up to you, but we do recommend actually keeping all of these on. These are all things that you are good to stay abreast of. The 3rd setting is eligibility, which I will cover in a little bit, but just keep in mind that the eligibility setting is under account settings. So an eligibility profile is something that all new users will be prompted to complete. Returning users, you've already done this and you do not need to complete this again unless if there have been any changes. And what this does is that this will help identify the most relevant grant opportunities that are open for which you may be eligible. It's not telling you exactly that you're eligible for these grant opportunities, but it's telling you, hey, this is something that you may be eligible for that you might want to take a look at. To start your eligibility profile, go ahead and click on either the green View Programs button or Programs in the upper right-hand corner on that dark black bar. If you're a returning user, clicking on the Programs button will just take you directly to the Programs page. The profile is really simple. It's just one question. It's asking whether you're applying as an individual artist or scholar or on behalf of an organization or group. And you can actually select all that apply. So for example, if you are someone who is an individual scholar and you also work for an organization and you anticipate that you're going to be helping with the grant in some sort of way, you can select both individual artist or scholar and organization and save your profile, and it will automatically show you grants relevant to organizations and grants relevant to individual artists or scholars. And like I mentioned earlier, this is something that you can change at any time in your account settings. So when you are ready to start an application, again, you'll be clicking on Programs to view all available programs that are currently open. And once you find the one that you're looking for, in this case, it's FY23 Programming and Capacity Building Grants, click on that green More button. You'll be shown a short introduction for these grants, and also you should see a green Apply button. When you click the apply button, you'll be prompted to enter in the name of the organization or group that you're applying on behalf of. And once you've done that, you can go ahead and click the create account button. That will take you to your FY23 submission homepage. So this is where you see all of the required tasks, and this is where you will be submitting and editing your application. So from here, I'm actually going to switch to a live demonstration so you can see what SM Apply looks like and watch as I go through it. So here I am in my test submission. As you can see, I've already completed and worked on some of these tasks. And that's reflected up here in the progress bar. You'll notice that the review and submit buttons are not available for me to click, and that's because not all of the required tasks have been completed. Something else to take note is that on this left-hand side, you'll see that you have the option to add a collaborator. This is a really great feature. If you have multiple people working on the grant, just go ahead and add in their email address here. You can give them viewing access or viewing and editing access, as well as you can write a short introductory message if need be. Please keep in mind that collaborators with editing access can only complete tasks, but they will not be able to click submit. So if your grant writer is the last person working on the grant and it's 11:57 on February 18th, keep in mind that they're not going to be able to click submit. That can only be the person who created the submission in the first place. Another thing to be cautious about with collaborators is I would avoid situations where multiple people are working on the same task at the same time. So for example, let's say 2 people are working on the narrative. That's the situation I would stay away from, because you're never, you can never be too careful about which changes will override each other. So make sure that you're in communication with your collaborators about who's working on what and at what time. Moving on to the tasks, we do recommend that you start with the application narrative. When you click on a task, it should take up the majority of your screen. However, on the left-hand side, you should still have access to all of the tasks relevant to this application. You'll also notice that some of these tasks are filled in with a half green circle, with a green circle and a white check mark, or not filled in at all. This indicates when a task is in progress, not started, or marked as complete. In the narrative, this is where we determine whether you're applying as an organization or group. That would be the first question here. And this is important because some of the tasks, as some of you have noted in the chat, don't exactly apply to either category. So if you are applying as an organization, once you've marked the narrative as complete, you will have access to the 501c3 status check and the IRS letter of determination and the 990. If you are applying as a group, once again, if you click this option and you mark the narrative as complete, then you will not be seeing any of those tasks that I just mentioned. If you have any questions about how to do this, or if you're seeing a task that doesn't really apply, please reach out to staff and we can help you. Moving through the narrative, at the very bottom, you'll notice this is where you'll have your save and continue editing button, as well as your next button to move to the next page. And when you're in the middle of these pages, you will also have a previous button. Please only use these buttons to navigate through the pages of the narrative. Do not try to use the back button of your browser, because that is not going to take you where you need to go. So remember, it's either next or previous at the bottom of the narrative. This second page of the narrative is where you'll be answering questions related to the evaluative criteria that Takenia went over. And we did copy and paste the evaluative criteria from the guidelines so that you have them here for your reference. Please note that each text response does have a character count that does include spaces. So for example, you can see the character count here at the bottom of the text box. It's counted 4. And if I just insert a bunch of spaces, it's going to count those spaces as characters. So if you are drafting your application in Word and you're trying to keep within the character count, remember to look for the number that includes spaces. Something else to keep in mind for these text responses, it may be tempting to tell the panel, please go to www.my website for more information. We've seen this a lot, and this is something to avoid in the narrative. It may be tempting to do this to save space. However, the narrative is really the chance for you to explain in your own words, what it is that your organization has done over the last 12 months and why this project is relevant to the community. And that's really something that the panel is looking for as well. It's a risk to send them to a website in the narrative because you can't guarantee that every panelist will do this outside research. You can't guarantee that the panel will see exactly the information that you want them to see on the website. So again, this is really the space for you to explain in your own words the answers to each of these questions. Again, moving on to the next page, and here you can see the appearance of the previous button that you can use it when necessary. The last page of the narrative form is the project budget. Please read these instructions at the top of the project budget. They really tell you everything you need to know about what goes into these line items and how to fill it out. For example, we do ask that in the amount column that you please not use any symbols, any dollar signs or commas. So for example, if I were to put a comma in this 5,000, when I scroll all the way down to the bottom, it's going to have a hard time totaling my expenses because of that comma. So if you see any errors in things that are supposed to automatically calculate, go back through your budget and make sure that you get rid of any unnecessary characters. Another thing to note in the project budget is that we do ask that you asterisk all expenses that will be paid for by the Arts and Humanities grant. So as you can see, in this scenario, I would want the marketing and publicity and some artist compensation to be paid for by the grant. Also note that any asterisk expenses should clearly indicate how the grant request will be allocated. So either they should total to the grant request, or somewhere in the budget notes, you should explain what portions of the line items will be paid for by the grant. And again, make sure that they total to the grant request. Further down, we have in-kind expenses, which are non-cash expenses like donated items. If they don't apply, just go ahead and put not applicable. And then we have cash income. The first line item must be the Arts and Humanities grant with the amount that you're requesting. And if you have any other sources of income, so for example, a different grant or ticket revenue, that would go here. Afterwards, we have in-kind income, which should be the exact same line items as in-kind expenses. Again, if you have any questions about what this is, please reach out to staff and we're happy to talk you through it. And at the bottom, it'll automatically calculate your expenses and your income, and it'll remind you of the total project cost that you indicated on the very first page of the narrative. Please note that these three numbers must all match. Your budget must be balanced with equal expenses and income. And the panel gets really confused when this total project cost doesn't match the total expenses and income. So if these numbers don't match, I suggest going back through your budget and working out any kinks. Or maybe as you work through your budget, you realize the total project cost is different than what you expected. That's okay. Just go back to the first page of the narrative and change that number. And at the bottom, these are the budget notes. this is a really good opportunity to provide some more context for each of those line items. So for example, if you have performer fees, you can break down each of the performers' rates. If you have a venue rental, you can again break down that how you arrived at that number. And this is really helpful for the panel. So I would not skim on your answers in this section. Since this is the last page of the narrative, instead of a next button, you instead have a mark as complete button. So when I click this, I now have a green circle with a white check mark next to my application narrative task. And it actually turned the narrative into a PDF kind of format where I cannot edit it. If you do have any other edits for the narrative, or for any other task for that matter, that has already been marked as complete, all you need to do is click on the 3 dots in the upper right-hand corner and click edit. Do keep in mind that for the narrative specifically, it will take you to the last page, which is the project budget. So if your edit is for something on the previous pages, make sure to use the previous button and then come back to the project budget page and click mark as complete once again. Moving on to a different task. If in any case you get to a task and you get a pop-up that says reuse data, that means that you already have some data in the system for this task that maybe you completed in FY22. And if nothing has changed, you are welcome to reuse that data. So all you have to do is click add data, and it will repopulate with that information. And then you would just mark as complete. If for some reason you don't want to, there's something new that you'd like to upload or fill out, you can just click cancel. And in the event that you change your mind and you actually do want to reuse that data, it's up here in the upper right-hand corner. And once again, marked as complete. Excellent. Moving on to an upload task. Let's go to work samples. So we do have all the instructions for work samples at the top. These are directly from the guidelines, so please read through these. Staff would really rather not have to go through and trim any work samples that exceed the limits. We'd rather answer any questions beforehand. So if you have questions about any of the limits, please reach out to staff and we'd be happy to help. At the bottom here, you have an option to attach a file. If you click on show accepted formats, it'll show you all the file types that we can accept. And you also have the option to link to a video. This is only available for links to YouTube and Vimeo. If you have links to other websites that include videos, we suggest pasting those links into a PDF and uploading the PDF instead. When you upload a file, they'll appear at the bottom, just like these two samples that I have. If you click on the 3 dots to the right of that sample, you have the option to edit, preview, remove, and download. When you click edit for a file like a PDF, you have the option to rename that PDF, as well as add a description. So here you could add any viewing instructions for the panel if that's relevant. For a video, all you would do is enter in the link address. Again, you can edit the name of your video and you can add a description such as panel instructions. There is a separate area where you can have the work sample description, so that doesn't necessarily have to go here. A few things to note with the link address, please try and use the full YouTube or Vimeo link address. Please don't use any shorthand links such as bit.ly or u2.b, anything like that. Make sure you use the full link. And also make sure that your video is available to the public or unlisted. If it's private, and you'd like to keep it private, that's okay, but you have to include the password so that the panel has access to it. It'd be really unfortunate if you went through all this trouble and then the panel is somehow unable to view your video. So just keep that in mind as you go through these uploads. So we're going to mark this as complete. Just a few more notes before we finish out this section. There is something that says HCMC reporting data towards the end of the application. This is not related to your application, and this will not be seen by the panelists or factored into the panel review in any way. This is something that's requested from us from our funders, and it's for our own reporting purposes. So please do your best to fill out this form. And again, if you have questions, please let us know. At the end of your application, you'll notice there's a checklist and signature form. The checklist is more for your benefit to make sure that you've completed all the required materials. However, we do need your signature at the end. Your application must be signed in order to be completed and submitted. And with that, all the required tasks have been completed. You'll notice that the empty ones that I have here say optional, so there's no need for me to do them if they're not relevant. And at this point, you would be ready to submit. So if I click back to application, that'll just take me back to the submission homepage, and you'll see that the review and submit buttons are now available for me to click. When I click submit, it'll just ask me if I'm ready. If I click review, it basically just shows you one big scroll through of your entire application. And when you click submit, it'll let you know that you should look out for a confirmation email that your application has been submitted. If you do not get this email, please reach out to staff immediately and we can confirm whether we've received it on our end. Something else that a neat feature of SM Apply is that you can actually edit your application after submitting. This is important because staff will be working regular business hours on February 18th, which means that we won't be able to help you past 5:30 in the evening. So if you have any issues with SM Apply or lingering questions, or if you don't know if your application has been submitted properly and it's past 5:30, unfortunately, we can't help you. So what we recommend you do is that you complete the required tasks early, click submit, and then just continue editing up until the time of the deadline. So in this scenario, you've just submitted your application and you still need to make some extra edits. Here I am in the My Applications page. These are all of my in progress or completed applications. I realize that you may not have as many. These are all my test applications. Go ahead and look for FY23 programming and capacity building. Click on view, you'll notice it says submitted. And from here, because the deadline hasn't passed, you are free to click into any of these tasks, edit, and then make sure you remark them as complete. There's no need to submit them again, just make sure that you remark them as complete. And with that, I am going to pass it back to Takenia to finish out this webinar.
Thank you, Ana Alicia, for that very comprehensive overview of SM Apply. See here. There we go. So I'm going to talk a little bit about post-award activities. So if you receive a grant, please note that you will have to sign a grant agreement, which means that you are abiding by all the legal requirements for receiving a public award. For groups specifically, not organizations of 501c3 status, but for groups, we need a W-9 form with the grantee social security number or employee identification number. All grantees are required to fill out a Bill.com contact form and create a Bill.com account. And this is because we are totally virtual right now. So that means that we are not going to mail anything to you. We have made our payment process, we've streamlined it for efficiency and for safety. So that means that you will receive funds directly to your bank account. And this is done through bill.com. It's used by a number of organizations and businesses. So know that this is the safest way for us to get funds to you. It is the only way for us to get funds to you. So this is a requirement that you create this account. If you have a final report from a previous grant, make sure that's been submitted. Please also make sure that if you have any outstanding payments regarding constituent fee services, that those have been paid. And also keep in mind that we do not actually have control over when we receive money from the county government. So this means that, you know, although the earliest allowable start date for your project is July 1st, we may not actually have the money in hand by July 1st. Sometimes what happens is that, you know, the government gets busy and there's a delay that we can't control in terms of us receiving the funds. So here's what I would suggest. If your project is heavily reliant on this grant, you might want to start it a little bit later. It does not have to start on July 1st. That's the earliest allowable start date, but it can start later. It can start in the fall if you want to be safe. Because, you know, unfortunately, what happened last year is that we actually received our funding in September. Sometimes that happens. We hope that we'll receive it on time, but again, that's out of our control. So you might want to give yourself some wiggle room. Now, know if you're in a position where you can't give yourself wiggle room, if your project has to start on July 1st, know that you can use other funds and then use our money as a reimbursement. So if there are bills that you have to pay immediately, our funding can be used as a reimbursement in that case. I'm going to go over some general grant writing tips, and some of these tips are applicable for other proposals that you may submit to other public grant makers as well. So this is highly important. Annalicia touched on the important fact that, you know, you should never fear the submit button in SM Apply, because if you hit that button early, you can get back into your application as long as it's before the deadline and make any last minute edits. The worst thing to do to yourself is to wait until the last minute to hit that submit button. There's nothing worse for us to receive an email or a phone call from an applicant who says, I don't understand what happened. My application didn't go through. I hit the submit button at 11:58 on the day of the deadline. Don't put yourself in that position. As a rule of thumb, most grant makers use a website to electronically receive applications. And normally with these sites, keep this in mind with any, you know, electronic application you're submitting to anyone. If everyone's submitting at the same time, that can slow down the site. So, you know, you put yourself at great risk if you wait until the day of the deadline, like a minute before the deadline, to hit the submit button. Also, too, there's the issue of our current economic reality. So the next statement I'm going to make is not meant to scare you at all. It's meant to emphasize the importance of starting these applications as early as possible, so you have as much time as possible to get your questions answered by staff, to make sure that your application is as competitive as possible. Because here's the reality. COVID-19, as you all know, has been horrible for our sector. It's caused a lot of economic strife. The need for funding is very high. So demand has dramatically increased due to the pandemic. And also, again, we're in a large territory, and population-wise, Montgomery County has grown. So the number of eligible applications submitted each year tends to increase. What happened last year is that we got a higher number of applications than the previous year, but then we got flat funding. So higher number of applications with flat funding naturally makes this process more competitive for applicants. So that's why you want to give yourself time to make sure that you're writing clearly, that you're submitting the most competitive work samples and supplementary materials, that you fully understand the guidelines. And the earlier you start, the better. We intentionally had templates available in December so that you all could plan ahead. We had them available last year so that you didn't have to wait till the last moment. So, don't hesitate to reach out to us. Don't make any assumptions, particularly if any of this is confusing for you. We're here to help. We want you to apply. I'm not trying to scare you. We want you to apply. We just want to ensure that you are giving yourself enough time so that you're not submitting a rush proposal that's unclear with typos. You don't want the panel to be confused about what you've written. It's always helpful to review previous descriptions for projects that we have funded in past years. That's all available on our website. You can do a deep dive if you want to. It goes pretty far back, but definitely look at last year's in particular. And this is definitely important for new applicants, but also too, even if you've gotten funding in this category for years, it never hurts to go back and review the types of projects that have been supported. We've already stated this, just read the instructions carefully in SM Apply and the guidelines as you work on your application and your supplementary materials and your work samples. Remember that the evaluative criteria should be embedded in each section of your narrative and the work samples and the supplementary materials. So when you're having a hard time making a choice, please always go back to the evaluative criteria, because it should be clearly threaded throughout the full proposal. So when I say write clearly and concisely and make good use of the space in the narrative, a couple of things to keep in mind. Applicants can get concerned about lack of space and character count. Annalicia provided one example with, the danger of putting in a website in the narrative section to try to save space. That's not the best move because it can confuse the panel. But also too, it's also not a good idea to do bulleted lists. You want to write in full sentences and full paragraphs. You run the risk of a bulleted list. The panel may not understand your point with a simplified list, even if you think it's clear, it may not be clear to a panelist. Please avoid jargon, all right? You wanna use plain language. I would not use, labels that are highly specific to your unique genre. Avoid academic jargon, just write clearly and concisely. Avoid acronyms. I mean, you can include acronyms, I'll restate it. You can include them, just make sure you spell it out at least once. What we found is when people are rushing, they forget to spell out the acronym. And again, the panel doesn't have the time to do outside research. So, don't put a panelist in a position where they feel like they have to get on Google. They're advised not to do that. Actually, really what you provide should stand on its own. So break down all of those acronyms. I think it's always smart to have someone who's unfamiliar with the work that you do proofread your application for clarity. I think it's really easy for any of us when we're like highly immersed in our day-to-day activities to make false assumptions about what's clear in our descriptions. And so if you have someone who, is not that well acquainted with your organization or group and they have the time to read your proposal, that's a really smart thing to do. If they get it, then you're good to go. If they have a whole bunch of questions, you need to revisit your work. And I say that because, as I mentioned earlier, panelists will have a strong understanding of the sector, as in the arts and humanities sector, but don't assume they know your organization or group. To give you an example, I remember doing a feedback appointment once with an applicant who was confused about the panel's feedback on their financials. And she said, well, they don't understand, she was like, how could they not understand that we overcame such a huge deficit that was created 5 years ago? Well, the reality is that the applicant didn't discuss their previous deficit at all, right? So the panel didn't know about it because it wasn't brought up in the proposal because the panel didn't know that applicant's history. So that's a clear situation where if something from your past is meaningful and applies to the present and it's not obvious in the initial description of what you do, you need to make sure that's clear, right as if the panelist has no idea of what your organization does, right as if the panelist has never heard of you. That's the safest way to go. Remember that support materials and work samples are highly important. Take your time choosing the best of the best that you have access to. And like I said earlier, it's super smart to attend the panel meeting. It's a wonderful educational resource. So, we hope that you're able to attend. All right, so a friendly reminder that applications must be submitted by 11:59, February 18th of this year. Please don't wait until 11:59 to hit the submit button on February 18th. Please hit that submit button earlier. Please make sure that everything is included by the deadline, that you've met all the requirements in terms of answering all the questions, support materials, work samples. We can't accept anything mailed or emailed. So let's say, you're rushing and you hit the submit button at 11:58 on Friday, February 18th, and your application just happens to make it through and you're thinking, oh, thank goodness. And then the next day you wake up and you realize you forgot to include some staff bios. You're out of luck, okay? We can't accept those staff bios by email or through the snail mail. If you didn't include it, then that's it. We'll just have to take what we have by the time of the deadline. So, we're also working virtually. So again, please don't try to drop off any items at our office because we won't receive them. Everything needs to be submitted through SM Apply. Please remember to sign up for our newsletters. We offer a variety of opportunities for the community. So, to ensure that you're kept in the loop about future grant opportunities, you want to sign up, but also too, we have other professional development offerings. We just did a lovely, what we call healing hour. These are really wonderful networking virtual events where grantees and applicants are able to converse with other people in their sector who are, who have the same struggles. It's really a good time to communicate with others so that you're not alone during a challenging time for our sector. So it was a wonderful time to offer communal uplift, and we plan to do more of those. So to ensure that you're aware of those opportunities, please sign up for our newsletter. So here's our fabulous staff. All of my phenomenal colleagues are listed here and are happy to help you. You can email me directly. There's nothing wrong with that at all. I'm happy to receive your emails, but do keep in mind that it's safer to CC the rest of my staff, because at the end of the day, as the grants director, sometimes I get pulled in a different direction. Sometimes Susan, our CEO, or Joe, the deputy director, will pull me in a different direction to work on stuff that they're working on. So Karen, Annalicia, and Dorothea are prompt in terms of their email responses, and you'll probably get a quicker response from them. My response during certain times of the year might be a bit delayed. So honestly, I would start off with Karen and Annalicia and Dorothea. Feel free to include all of them in your email. Sometimes that's also the best way to do it, just in case someone's out, someone's on sick leave or annual leave. If you include all three of them, it ensures that someone will be able to respond to your message in a timely manner. So with that, I'm going to answer questions. It looks like we have a bunch of actually really smart questions in the chat. I saw Annalicia. I'm sorry.
I've been going through the chat and answering some questions here and there. So I thought it would be nice if I just pulled out some questions that I saw repeated.
Yeah, no problem. Mm-hmm.
So we do have some questions about how virtual events can meet the requirement of taking place in Montgomery County.
Right. So you'll notice in the application, there are questions about why you have chosen a specific platform. You need to make the case in your application for why it will resonate with the county specifically, even if people outside of the county have access to it. So obviously we have no problem with people outside of the county having access to your virtual event, but at the end of the day, the case needs to be made that A, as an applicant, you are housed within the county, devoted to the county, have some form of county buy-in, and that the project itself benefits the county. So whether it's virtual, in person, or hybrid, when you answer those questions in the application, please make sure that you clearly explain how the local community will benefit, even if it's virtual. So I hope that answers your question. If it doesn't, feel free to contact staff and we can talk to you individually about your program.
Thanks, Takenia. We also have a few questions about funding a program director for an existing program. Would that be eligible?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the whole project can't be just that one salary. If you want to be careful about competitiveness here. So if you submitted one proposal and it was just for one salary for work you're already doing, that's not a very compelling ask. If this is somehow embedded into capacity building, that works. If you want to pay staff, you're always allowed to pay staff for your projects, obviously. But there needs to be another component to the project. And you know, if it's for something that already started, that will confuse the panel, because remember, the earliest allowable start date is July 1st. If it looks like you're describing activities that occurred before July 1st, they'll question eligibility, and we will as well. So when we do our eligibility check, if we don't see any discussion of upcoming activities, we will also question the eligibility of the project. Now, do keep in mind, if this is part of a large project that's in phases, that's a little different, right? So let's say you've been working on a strategic plan, and the strategic plan is heavily focused on amping up your fundraising capabilities. And the next phase of the strategic plan is to make sure that your board has access to professional development in regards to fundraising. So you want to send your board to a bunch of fundraising classes. This is just a hypothetical. That's eligible and competitive. So you could, I guess, technically see that as part of a phase of implementing your strategic plan, but the project itself is for upcoming professional development for your board. So I hope that's clear. And again, if it's not, if you have specific questions about your own project, don't hesitate to contact us.
Thanks. Another question or question that I see repeated is, do all these support materials need to be from FY21?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the answer is no. I mean, ideally, try to pick support materials that are as recent as possible, but we know that programming has been really difficult for a number of organizations and groups during the pandemic. You may have had periods where you just couldn't offer any programming, and that may be not your fault at all. It could be that you just couldn't get around pandemic restrictions, or maybe, you know, when the shutdown occurred, even in 2020, you were thrown off guard and you didn't have the technology in order to do virtual programming. The panel is highly aware of the detriment caused by the pandemic. So know that if you had a programming lull and you need to choose from older work samples, that's perfectly allowable. Again, the more recent, the better, but it definitely doesn't have to be from 2021. And particularly, if you think your 2021 work samples are for some reason significantly weaker, let's say it was just a wonky year for you and your staff, you just struggled, things didn't really work out. If your samples from 2020 for some reason, or even 2019 are significantly stronger than 2021, that's what you want to submit, the strongest that you have access to.
Thank you, Takenia. And just in case if this wasn't clear, your financial support materials and organizational support materials do have to be from your most recently completed fiscal year.
Thanks, Annalise. Good point.
The last question we have is, what % is allowable for staffing costs for a program or a project rather?
Right, that's also a good question. And one size doesn't fit all, so I can't give you a direct answer. I just want you to think about equitable payment, your own capacity, and how that's in alignment with the structure of your project. So, you know, obviously a larger project with a whole bunch of staff requires a different amount in your budget devoted to paying staff versus like a project that, you know, is short term and only involves one staff person. I'll say this, the panel does want to see equitable payment, and I know that will probably make you cringe because, again, we are all cognizant of the fact that the pandemic has caused such economic strain. But if you're faced with a situation where you need to scale back in order to pay equitably, like let's say, for example, I'm actually going to use the example of artists, because what happened last year is that the panel brought up repeatedly their concern with the number of applicants who they felt were underpaying artists. So whether it's artists or staff, if you are looking at a situation where you could, you know, design a larger long-term process, but you'll have to underpay people, it's to your detriment to do that. What would benefit you more is to scale back, include fewer staff and fewer artists so that you can pay them more, even if it's something really intimate. So it could be that with your budget limitations, you only have the money to present that one stellar visual artist. But if that one stellar visual artist is creating top-notch work and you pay them equitably, that's more competitive than doing a, you know, large exhibition with 20 artists that are underpaid. Or maybe it's a situation where, you know, since this was more about staff payment, you're presenting that one awesome artist and you have enough to pay that awesome artist and that curator at an equitable level, and that's it. And that's all you're including in the budget. That's more competitive than underpaying a whole bunch of artists and underpaying a curator and having an admin assistant who's severely underpaid. Better to scale back if that allows you to pay a little bit more versus making your project expansive and paying less. I hope that helps. I know that's broad. It's hard for me to answer the question because even within this category, we've got some budget diversity. All of our categories at the end of the day end up with applicants who have various different sizes of budgets. So again, if you need more help with your own determination for how much money you can allocate in your budget to paying staff or artists or scholars, don't hesitate to reach out to us. That's a very important subject. We're happy to help you out with figuring that out if my answer was too vague for you.
Thanks, Takenia. We are over time, so if you have other questions or more specific questions, we do encourage you to call or email us.
I want to thank everyone for attending. Your questions were super smart, and I'm glad that you asked them. I'm always happy to see, you know, good questions in the chat. We wish you the best of luck. We're excited to read your proposals, and I just want to end with a statement of uplift, even though we're over time. Keep your head up. We know it's rough out there. We know this has been an incredibly hard few years due to the pandemic. I do honestly think we're going to pull through this. Staff wants to help you. Susan and Joe are always advocating for emergency funds. So know that as we head into advocacy season, we always ask for more funding because we know the need is great. So keep your head up, and we look forward to reading your phenomenal applications. Take care, everyone.